the unconscious. And so on that path of liberation, Brother Kwame Ture starts us off. He gets us in the mood for a struggle in regards to what it is that we are doing. And what it is that we're doing this evening is developing and furthering a theory that has been established from our ancestors and our elders and comrades in revolutionary struggle. And that is the foundation of an African revolutionary political philosophy. Coming from the West, being Africans who have been culturalated and formulated and captured and matriculated in the Western Hemisphere, we have a certain perspective in regards to revolutionary struggle and that history that comes from the local and regional and national examples of African revolutionary struggle that we can draw from here in the United States. And then there are those international examples too. And so we want to draw from this evening both of those perspectives in regards to understanding what is the foundation, African fundamental revolutionary political philosophy that we as organizers, as activists, as revolutionaries should promote, organize around, and make as a foundational principle for the organizational struggles that we are involved in as a people. And so to do that, since we're coming from the diaspora, I'd like to begin with Garvey, where within his volume Life and Lessons, he gives us from our perspective as African that viewpoint on what during those days was termed Negro nationalism, which we understand today as being African nationalism. The culmination of the efforts of the UNIA must end in Negro or African independent nationalism. And if I can, I will, where he says Negro, if I'm allowed that platitude to interject that word in those places where he says Negro. The culmination of all the efforts of the UNIA must end in African independent nationalism on the continent of Africa. That is to say, everything must contribute toward the final objective of having a powerful nation for the African race. African nationalism is necessary. It is a political power and control. No race is free until it has a strong nation of its own in its own system of government and its own order of society. Never give up this idea. Let no one persuade you against it. It is the only protection of your generation and race. Hold on to the idea of an independent government and nation so long as other men have them. Never be satisfied to always live under the government of other people, because you shall ever be at their mercy. Visualize for yourself and your children and generations unborn of the race, your own king, your own emperor, your own president, your own government officials and administrations who look like you. God never could have intended to make you as you look and as you are, and to make your king, president, emperor, and ruler different to you in race. This must be a license for you to disobey the laws of kings and of other races or rulers of other races while you live under their control. Let me say that again, Garvey. This must not be a license for you to disobey the laws of kings of other races or rulers of other races while you live under their control, but you must always seek and work for a government of your own, absolutely, where you and your children will have a chance, like anybody else in the state, to rise from the lowest to the highest position, which you may not attain under other governments, but while you will have under, but But while you will have under alien governments to get the best out of them as your citizenship's right, but always have in view doing something to make it possible for your race to have a nation and a government of its own. So in seeking to form that nation and government of our own, in understanding that we have to put together the foundational principles, building upon that has been already set forth by our ancestors, but knowing that we have to add those nuances of technology and the history that has developed since the time of those ancestors to make a true high-tech, technological, modern, revolutionary force that can carry out power, that has control of technology and the systems of society, and foot soldiers on the ground that they can go forward with, right? So looking at what it is that the philosophy is coming from Garvey. Garvey told you, you have to have a nation. You can't stop until you got one. That don't mean do what the best thing to do is get from up under them. Yeah, you got to fight them while you're there, right? True enough. And of course, as we know, Garvey did. But the main goal is to get from up under them, right? And when you're getting from up under them, then you have to have together the plan of action, the development of the philosophy, the economic, political, social system that will be developed that best fits that geographical area, wherever it is that you will be repatriating to, or wherever it is that you will be establishing this coordinated effort, right? And so, as we do often, we look to Africa. Because, of course, on the African continent, these examples of government and socialism have been developed to its zenith in regards to African people. And in the foundation of these nations, the independence explosion in the continent of Africa, among all the documents that were written, there's one that really set forth the blueprint for Africa going forward in economic, social, and political independence. It wasn't followed by a lot of nations. But as I said, we have to understand how to take these principles, these things that have been laid forth, put the new African spin on it, and present it back to our people in a cogent, organized formation. And so what we do here is look at those philosophies and see how these things can be further implemented. In Tanzania, Brother Julius Nyerere was very successful in regards to the development of that nation. I mean, think about it today. Tanzania, free from the internal conflict that other nations have for the most part, independent, economically viable. I mean, and politically revolutionary. Remember, Baba Geronimo Jaga went and transitioned in Tanzania, coming straight out of prison, looking for a country in Africa. I know some of the comrades that was working around that case. They were able to get him home so that he could transition on the continent of his ancestors, right? So Tanzania had a original president after their independence by the name of Julius Nyerere, who was a very futuristic thinking African. And in this document that was written called the Arusha Declaration, the capital of Tanzania's is no longer Arusha, but Arusha is still the spiritual center, the ancestral center, where the laws and philosophy of that people come down. And so Nyerere was able to go into that ancient political philosophy of his people, and what he came up with was socialism. And the document that he laid forth is called the Arusha Declaration. The party of Julius Nyerere is called the Tanzania African National Union. You will notice that in Southern Africa, in the oftentimes they would take on this. You had ZANU, the Zimbabwe African National Union, right? You had ZAPU, Zimbabwe African Patriotic Union. So these movements, of course, well, as I'm discussing now, Zimbabwe, which took place further after the 60s and the 80s, when they finally achieved their liberation, took on the same model. This was the socialist model. This is the model that Julius Nyerere set forth. And he implemented it as part of the government, the Tanzania African National Union. Some of these points, the part one, they have the TANU Creed. It says the policy of TANU is to build a socialist state. The principles of socialism are laid down in TANU Constitution, and they are as follows, wherein TANU believes all human beings are equal. Every individual has a right to dignity and respect. And so they lay out these 10 points. But what I want to get to is, because we're developing the political philosophy, so those are the human right aspects of what Julius is laying down. But we want to get into further the structure of the state. Right? And we can go back, and if anyone has any questions on the humanist aspects of the Arusha Declaration, I definitely can cover that. But I want to get into the governmental structure because, of course, as you know, what we've been doing here is building upon the consciousness of, as Baba Kwame said, the unconscious, and then even those of the conscious among us, so that we understand where it is that we're going in this journey towards the foundation of an independent state, or repatriating to an independent state, so that we can, as Baba Marcus Garvey just said, live free from under the clutches of the imperialists. And so as a part of this policy in the Arusha Declaration, Baba Nyerere says in part 2, the policy of socialism, absence of exploitation. A truly socialist state is one in which all people are workers. It does not have two classes of people, a lower class composed of people who work for their living and an upper class of people who live on the work of others. In a really socialist country, no person exploits another. Everyone who is physically able to work does so. Every worker obtains a just return for the labor he performs. And the incomes derived from different types of work are not grossly divergent. In a socialist country, the only people who live on the work of others and who have the right to be dependent upon their fellows are small children, people who are too old to support themselves, and crippled, and those whom the state at any time cannot provide with an opportunity to work for their living. So if you're young, elder, or crippled and infirm, then you have the right to say, hey, I need some help. These are the foundational principles. It doesn't say that you're going to have to pay for it, and that if you don't have insurance that you can get that help, right? These are the foundational principles, understand, of which government should be set forth upon. Also, the major means of production and exchange are under the control of the peasants and the workers. To build and maintain socialism, it is essential that all the major means of production and exchange in the nation are controlled and owned by the peasants through the machinery of their government and their cooperatives. Further, it is essential that the ruling party should be a party of peasants and workers, right? So the people who make up the foundation of the government are not of the elite. They are those that come from, and they're further, the districts are designated and working in tradition with the local leaders, send their representative to that larger state body. Speaking of which, the existence of democracy. A state is not socialist simply because its means of production and exchange are controlled or owned by the government, either wholly or in part. For a country to be socialist, it is essential that its government is chosen and led by the peasants and workers themselves. If the minority governments of Rhodesia or South Africa controlled or owned the entire economies of their respective countries, the result would be a strengthening of oppression, not the building of socialism. True socialism cannot exist without democracy also existing in the society. So the imperialist line of that their socialism being undemocratic, Nyerere destroys with that point. You're always going to have a means of representation from individual communities in any civilized society. But that difference being that these exploitative relationships, particularly of capitalist Western governments and businesses, doesn't exist because there can be no exploitation of the people. This makes a major difference in the individual existence of people. If the people that are under the threat of the coronavirus know that the healthcare, true healthcare, is available to them without any economic price, then it would make a different mentality for the people. So you see how the system of government is responsible for what the mentality of the people is and how that goes forward. Further, Baba Nyerere says, do not let us depend upon money for development. We don't have any money for development. It's our labor that's important. It's that which they've been wanted to steal originally and are continuing to steal. Think about the example of Thomas Sankara. Think about the deforestation, the de-desertification, tactics that he carried forth. Only by the hands of the people. They just took sand and just kept putting bags of sand, just make a wall so big that the sand couldn't blow over there no more. Then they planted crops on the other side of the sand wall, and them crops, they watered them and they bloomed and they turned the desert back. Then they'll tear down that wall and move the wall further back the next year. And then they took back the desert by those efforts, just off the might, off the strength of the people. And so when they're organized in that manner, you don't have to take for you to wait till somebody give you a job and then you sign the application and give them your social security card and driver's license and then wait till they call you and all that. Just like, no, in the community where you're at, where you live, you're going out there because it's going to benefit you and you're going to have more land to grow your crops. And so that's the kind of symbiotic governmental to people. And then the government come, they supply the sandbags, they supply the shovel, they supply the trucks to move it with, right? And then that government to people relationship is built that way, completely free of, as Nyerere says, that economic exploitation principle, right? So that's how we reach development, and that's how we get to the point of independence economically and development-wise. The policy of self-reliance, part 3, Nyerere. I love this part. He says, we are at war. That is the quote that leads off the paragraph. Tano is involved in a war against poverty and oppression. It is our weakness that has led to our being oppressed, exploited, and disregarded. Now we want a revolution which brings to an end our weakness, so that we are never again exploited, oppressed, or humiliated. The next paragraph has the title of "A Poor Man Does Not Use Money as a Weapon." These are governmental principles that Nyerere is laying forth here, but that transmit to the people. We're talking about converting the unconscious to conscious, laying these African philosophical political principles in place. Because it's obvious that in the past we have chosen the wrong weapon for our struggle, because we chose money as our weapon. We're trying to overcome our economic weakness by using the weapon of the economically strong. Weapons which, in fact, we do not possess. By our thoughts, words, and action, it appears as if we have said, money is the basis of development. Without money, there can be no development. Each year, each ministry of government makes its estimates of expenditure. Every ministry puts forward very good development plans. When the ministry presents its estimates, it believes that the money is there for the asking, but that Minister for Finance and his ministry are being obstructed. And regularly each year, the Minister for Finance has to tell his fellow ministers that there is no money. And each year, the ministries complain about the Ministry of Finance when it trims down their estimates. Right? They want the money, but it ain't there. Similarly, when members of parliament and other leaders demand that the government should carry out a certain development, they believe that there's a lot of money to spend on such projects, but that the government is the stumbling block. Yet such belief on the part of ministries, members of parliament, and other leaders does not alter the stark truth, which is that government has no money. When it is said that government has no money, what does this mean? It means that the people of Tanzania have insufficient money. The people pay taxes out of the very little wealth they have. It is from those taxes that the government meets its recurrent and development expenditure. If one calls on the government to spend more, one is in effort calling on the government to increase taxes. Calling on the government to spend more without raising taxes is like demanding that the government should perform miracles. It is equivalent to asking for more milk from a cow while insisting that the cow should not be milked again. Yeah. And so these foundation principles within the Arusha Declaration lay out this foundation for the development of African government free from exploitation, free from loans connected to the West, free from a viewpoint that from the ministries that says the government should have all of this money. In other words, they have to develop strategies whereby which the strength and might and labor of the people are the currency, and that we don't look to the tool of the enemy for the development of our nations. This must be succinctly clear, because where we are right now, even in regards to on the continent, we're still stuck in that. We're still stuck in the IMF and World Bank loans and that whole game right there. We haven't broken out of that yet. So Nyerere gives us this overarching philosophy of development through the basis of African socialism, right? And which that philosophy from that time was further development into with Kwame Nkrumah and others, Sekou Touré, Amilcar Cabral, and others into African scientific socialism. That is what that particular train of thought, those revolutionary governments, those revolutionary movements that had been involved at that period of time, culminating in combination of the diaspora struggle with the African struggle, that in others, but also in the person of Kwame Touré, having been the as Kwame Nkrumah and Sekou Touré were co-presidents of Guinea, serving as their secretary. And so that's why we open with Kwame, letting us know that it is our task, speaking to activists, speaking to organizations in regards to the direction that we go in, relating to the continent, and what is the overarching philosophy that we go forward with, so that we can look to build a united front effort and already be clicking on cylinders when this thing jump, because we already on the same page. And if we're not, then we understand that too. And that's very important to know also. And so kind of going back into our history to understand. So we heard Nyerere, we heard from Garvey, we see the foundation of African nationalism from the aspirin perspective, saying we have to get from up under this imperialist government. We see the foundation of African socialism, African scientific socialism, with Julius Nyerere and the Arusha Declaration. And so we take a step back in history, right, to go to understand the developmental psychology briefly of the African, right? To take a ethno philosophy perspective, to say that we are Bantu people, right? We have different tribes of people on the continent. The Nilotic, or what they call the Bantu. You had the San people, the desert dwelling, the Twa. And so from that, what we call Bantu philosophy, or Ubuntu, these principles, these things, philosophically, not culturally or religiously, but philosophically, as a way of living as people, right? I want to make that clear. We talk about Bantu philosophy. We talk about Bantu philosophy in its social context in regards to the relationships between people, tribes, and nations, right? Going back, just take a little step back in history, right? And so when you look at the origins of Bantu philosophy, or ontology, right? That anthropological perspective of a people, the general notion of being, that foundational principle. We're seeing that the Bantu soul hankers after life and force, right? The fundamental notion under which being is conceived lies within the category of forces. Christian thought in the West, having adopted the terminology of Greek philosophy and perhaps under its influence, has most generally been based upon the fundamentally static conception of being. Herein is to be seen the fundamental difference between Western thought and that of the Bantu. We conceive the transcendental notion of being by separating it from its attribute, force, but the Bantu cannot. Force, in his thought, is a necessary element in being, and the concept force is inseparable from the definition of being. There is no idea among Bantu of being divorced from the idea of force. Without the element force, being cannot be conceived. We hold a static conception of being dynamic, a force, dynamo. Bantu speak, act, live as if for them beings were forces. Force is not for them an adventitious, accidental reality. Force is even more than a necessary attribute of beings. Force is the nature of being. Force is being. Being is force. When we think in terms of the concept being, they use the concept force. Where we see concrete beings, they see concrete forces. When we say that beings are differentiated by their essence or nature, Bantu say that forces differ in their essence or nature. They hold that there is a divine force, celestial, terrestrial, human forces, animal forces, vegetation, and even material or mineral forces. We must insist once again that force is not for Bantu a necessary, that force is not for Bantu a necessary, irreducible attribute of being. No, the notion of force takes for them the place of the notion being in our philosophy. Just as we have, so have they, a transcendental, elemental, simple concept. With them force, with us being. It would be a misuse of words to call the Bantu dynamists or energists. As if the universe were animated by some universal force, a sort of unique magical power encompassing all existence, as certain authors seem to believe, judging from their treatment of mana, wanga, or kanga. Such is an European presentation of a primitive philosophy that is but imperfectly understood. The Bantu make a clear distinction and understand an essential difference between different beings. That is to say, different forces. Among the different kinds of forces they have come to recognize, just as we do, unity, individuality, but individuality clearly understood as meaning individuality of forces. So here we understand the fundamental principle, the Bantu principle, that force is being. For the European being and concrete things is what represents force. Understand me? Because when you understand the foundational principles philosophically that people are coming to or coming out of as they're forming a government, then you can understand and everybody once again can be on the same page. So if force is the underlying principle of Bantu philosophy, if force, think about it. Just think about it. We're talking about government, but think about force. I know in our mind you think about force, the police force, force used against, but think about it. See how things reverse? We've been acculturated to think that force and violence and these things are against the principle of human nature and being. The Bantu philosophy says that force, not only is that force not separated from being, but you cannot be a being and not understand the accumulation and use of the instrument of force in your spirit and your power is your foundation principle of being. So when you accept that and adopt that in your heart and in your spirit, then you will be more in tune with those foundational principles of African being that we have been established upon, that we have been separated from. Force is being. If you're not utilizing force, if you don't understand that the whole power, he said it'd be correct. Don't call us energists. It ain't about the energy. It ain't about the energy, right? No. We're using force. We're force beings. We project. We don't sit. We're not passive in that as a foundational principle of a people. We're philosophical. We're visual. But underneath that, those things, even that vision, that word speak sound, these things have to be adopted as forces of our being that are foundational principles that we have to work from. So in regards to understanding where we are as a people and how the philosophy of the Bantu, that is what we come out of, and in the West, that diaspora community that has been captured from its mother continent in many and spread out through many lands through the West. And then coming back to and understanding those foundational principles of Nyerere, of African socialism, understanding that there is no way forward in liberation for African people without socialism, without African socialism, without African centered scientific socialism. There's nothing, you can't call it nothing else. You can't try to reform it. You can call it revolutionary Pan-African socialism, but you're going to have that socialism in there. And it's going to be revolutionary when you break it down to the principles that the foundation of it comes from. You ain't going to try to give us no Pan-Africanism that's mixed with capitalism, where you just want to come and make some money, and you're not developing a system whereby which these resources can be taken to full market by the people who working on the ground. That means no company comes in your country and extract the resources out of there raw, right? And go and take it and then sell it back to you. That means if it come out the ground, because the workers and the peasants own the corporation or whatever business structure we set up in that type of society, that when the raw oil come out the ground, they're going to be the ones that work in the refinery. They're going to be the jewelers that make it into the final product, and then we'll sell it to whoever it is. We might have the children or somebody else put a little bling on it, or whatever the latest little thing about it. But every person in that society will touch it once and benefit off of it before it leaves from here. That's socialism. That's how you do it. The workers and the peasants owning the means of production, right? And so what I wanted to do is just look at from the ground point, from the revolutionary perspective, from Comrade Amilcar Cabral, of course. So we're looking at the philosophy, and I want to look at it in practice here in regards to Comrade Amilcar, as we know, who was really one of the most intellectual of the on-the-ground revolutionaries, and he left us this volume. This is one of the volumes, Unity and Struggle, the speeches and writings of Amilcar. But from the African perspective, from on the ground, and we've covered weeks before Sankara and Nkrumah and others, and this is. I just wanted to dig a little deeper in the archives to give you another perspective of one of the comrades on the ground and how he presents from their aspect of struggle. Political reality, Amilcar says. The political reality of our land is that the greater reality that we all know well, it is the fact that we are a Portuguese colony. Our people could rule themselves neither in Guinea nor in Cape Verde. The Portuguese ruled even if they might appoint a black administrator, as only Honorio Barreto had the honor or disgrace of being. So Amilcar called out one of the neo-colonialists there, Honorio Barreto. And the truth was that the Portuguese ruled in our land, Portuguese colonialism. And it was this greater reality that created the conflict between us and the Portuguese. Exploitation of our people under the cover of Portuguese policy. This basically is what generated our struggle. Our struggle grew so much that we must take advantage of it to transform even geographical reality to the extent that we can. It would seem improbable, but it is the truth. For when we build dams, bridges, etc., we shall change the geographical landscape of our land. We are going to make a new human geography that we are creating in our land. When we completely transform the islets of Villacos, when we make Cape Verde into a magnificent center for world tourism, for example, this will already be a new geographical reality that we are creating. The ships which now pass by far out to sea will begin to stop there, but we must, through this struggle, transform the economic reality of our land. Let us put an end to exploitation by the Portuguese. But let us put an end to exploitation of our people by our own folk. And we must develop our land, make it progress as much as possible. This is what our struggle means. Social reality, cultural reality. Everything is going to change. And already a new political reality has risen in our land, and it is following. We are ruling ourselves. Obviously, our reality has strengths and weaknesses, as I've already shown you. For example, the fact that we do not have great economic development is a serious weakness, but it is also a strength. For if our land had important mines, important factories, etc., the imperialists would have come into the war more quickly and in greater strength. Perhaps we should have had to fight not only against the Portuguese, but against other imperialists as well. As it is, at least we have a quieter life, just bush and desert. Beautiful, beautiful, Amir Carr. Beautiful analysis from that perspective, that revolutionary colony there. And speaking of Cape Verde Islands and the development of it into a great tourist spot, and as we know now, it's ripe exploitation, Cape Verde. And you can see this on any visitation, on any research into that nation. So, looking at, as we're coming to our conclusion here, looking at the overall basis of the African political philosophy coming out of the diaspora nations, coming out of being captured following the tradition of Marcus Garvey and those revolutionary organizations and nations. Right? Myself coming from the Seminole, there being the Yamasi, there being the Garifuna, there being the Gullah, there being the Palenques, there being the Quilombos, all over South and Central America. All of these revolutionary organizations, nations, and communities that have been dispersed through this Western Hemisphere. When we get to the point of that true Pan-Africanism that we speak of, the root that our political philosophies will unify around will be these revolutionary African socialist principles, this Bantu philosophy, and which is the use of force as being, when we start wanting to use force in our being in every way. And our enemy understands that. That revolutionary political African socialism, that Bantu ontology of thought as force as being, and in your face, on the ground, either you're going to have to tell me to go away and go on with that Black-ish, but at least we give the effort towards knowing that each and every African person understood where we were in these diasporic communities, that Africa is the center, and that arms wide open and let's unite. What I'd like to leave us with is Comrade Diop, Cheikh Anta Diop, to be exact. In his volume, Black Africa, the Economic and Cultural Basis for a Federated State, which we'll be doing that one as just like a whole joint, because Diop in this joint, Black Africa, how many pages is Black Africa? 125 pages. But it's the most focused political analysis of the development of Africa that even to this day that I've seen, because the things that he talks about, developing the river valleys, right? So in this furthering of this African political philosophy, as we're speaking of, right? Political unity and federalism. Understand these different, as we'll get into later on, these different forms of government. There's the democracy, there's republic, there's the federalist state, all these different territorial states, all these different forms of a state, right? But Diop says that political unity and federalism, the historical significance of national liberation movements in colonies, especially those of Black Africa, is no longer open to question. It is now readily admitted that this powerful decolonizing drive is as significant as the national movements of Europe during the 19th century. Apart from these colonies largely peopled by Europeans where resistance is inevitable, with few exceptions, there is less and less violent opposition to the development of the movement. The new tactic, rather, consists in trying to redirect, channel it toward non-socialistic forms of the so-called Western type, right? Like Diop is saying, trying to channel African governments towards the Western form, non-socialist, right? If this goal were to be reached, the former colonial powers and the United States might stop worrying. So Diop is letting you understand the move towards this capitalistic, neo-colonialist state, as he saw before he transitioned in the 80s, right? That non-socialistic form of government we just have to put it out of our mind. If the unconscious are going to convert the conscious, they got to understand you got to be socialist. That's just all it is to it. I gave you Diop, I gave you Cabral, I gave you Nyerere, I gave you Garvey, you got Dr. Clarke. Socialism is the foundation governmental principle. African fundamental socialism, revolutionary scientific socialism, revolutionary Pan-African socialism is the way forward for the revolutionary organizations in the diaspora, and it's been shown by us, by those revolutionary organizations on the continent and governments from Angola to Zimbabwe and Zambia and Libya. And so we have to take and examine these things if we're serious about really either becoming a nation or repatriating to and contributing to our continental nation or the diaspora nations, whichever choice that we make, whichever direction. Provide support, organizational effort to those revolutionary African socialist nations. Provide support to those Latino socialist nations. Provide support to those Asian socialist nations. Do your proper research. The Pan-African Revolution is going to be a revolution of a globe. Find every African population of people that you can. Forward to them the information of revolutionary African socialist organizational and governmental struggle. This has been your combat reporter, Brother Tutmost Sakar, here on Al Kibalon News. And remember, as always, African people, stay vigilant.